Hello everyone. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's jump in. I was mapping an old fire road near the Canadian border, about 15 miles north of Eerie, Minnesota. It was late September, the kind of morning where the air smells like wet pine and distant wood smoke. I'd been working alone for 3 days, marking coordinates for a Forest Service project, meant to update outdated maps of old logging and fire roads that had mostly grown over. My GPS was acting up since the night before, but I figured I could still get a few hours of work in before heading back toward my truck. The sky was overcast, pale and flat, and everything around me felt damp from the morning fog. By noon, my GPS finally died for good. The screen froze, blinked once, and went black. I had a paper map folded in my back pocket, but the old roads didn't match what I was seeing anymore. I'd been following a pair of faint tire ruts that looked like they hadn't seen a vehicle in years. They wound between the trees, sometimes vanishing into tall grass before reappearing again. I told myself I'd stick to them and head south later to reconnect with my main route. The woods up there have a way of swallowing sound. There aren't many birds that time of year, and the air feels thick with quiet. My boots made soft, wet thuds on the ground, and every few minutes I'd hear something crack off in the distance. Branches shifting, squirrels darting, maybe a deer. I wasn't nervous, just focused, trying to make sense of where the old trail connected. After maybe an hour, the trees began to thin out ahead. I stepped into a clearing maybe 40 or 50 feet wide. The road split 3 ways. One track curved slightly left, another veered hard right, and the third cut straight through the middle. None of them matched anything on my map. I stood there for a minute, checking my compass, trying to line up the landmarks, but nothing fit. I picked the middle path. It looked the most used, if you could even call it that. Grass pressed down slightly, some faint indentations that might have been old tire marks. The woods on either side grew denser, darker. Fallen birch branches crisscrossed the path, and moss covered everything, even the rocks. I kept walking, trying to judge time by the light filtering through the clouds. After about 20 minutes, I came across something that didn't fit. The path opened into another small clearing, and in the middle of it was a ring of stones. Someone's fire pit. It wasn't old either. The rocks were blackened, and there was still a faint ash outline in the center. Inside it were animal bones, small ones, maybe rabbit or squirrel, but they'd been cleaned, not chewed. Each one was cut neatly at the joints, stripped of flesh. A few still had scorch marks. Nearby, sitting on a fallen log, was a row of empty tuna cans. There were maybe 6 or 7 of them, all lined up evenly. Each one punctured near the rim. The holes were too precise to be random. The labels had long peeled off, and they glinted dull silver in the gray light. Something about it felt off. It didn't look like an old campsite or a hunter's setup. It looked deliberate, like someone had arranged it to be seen. I crouched down to take a closer look, thinking maybe a researcher or trapper had been using the site. The ashes looked dry. No tracks in the dirt around it, no footprints that I could see. The silence started to press in. I realized I hadn't heard a single bird since I entered that clearing. Not even wind. Just my own breathing. I took a few steps back and looked around. That's when I noticed movement between the trees, maybe 30 feet away. It was a person, at least I thought it was. They were standing perfectly still in full camouflage, head to toe. Even their face looked covered with mesh or paint, I couldn't tell. I froze, trying to figure out if it was a hunter. It wasn't hunting season yet. Not for anything that far north, but people sometimes came early to scout. I lifted my hand and called out, "Hey!" My voice sounded too loud. The person didn't move, didn't even shift their weight. I called again, louder. Still nothing. Just that shape standing there between the trunks, perfectly still, like they were carved into the woods. My stomach dropped. Something about their posture, it wasn't right. Too stiff, too intentional. I took one step backward. The moment I did, The figure tilted its head slightly, like it was following my movement. That was enough for me. I turned and ran. I didn't even grab my pack. I just ran the way I came. My boots slipped on wet leaves. Branches slapped at my shoulders. And for a while, I didn't care if I was heading the right direction. I just wanted distance. I must have run for a good 10 minutes before I stopped to catch my breath. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I listened, expecting footsteps behind me, but there was nothing. No sound at all. I checked my watch. It was almost 3 in the afternoon. I kept walking fast until I found the spot where the road split 3 ways. I didn't even hesitate. I took the left path and kept moving until I recognized a section of the road that matched my notes from earlier that morning. By the time I reached my truck, it was past 5. The light was fading, that dull blue that comes before dark. I sat there for a long time trying to calm down. I told myself it had probably been some hunter or someone camping illegally. But the neatness of that fire pit, the clean bones, those cans, it didn't feel like a normal camp. And the way that person just stood there, watching, not answering, it kept replaying in my head. When I got back to the ranger station in Ely, I told them what I'd seen. 2 rangers, one named Mike and another named Tyler, agreed to come back with me the next morning to check it out. They said sometimes trappers leave strange setups, or maybe someone had been living out there off-grid. We drove out at sunrise, followed my tracks back to where I'd parked, and then hiked in on foot. I retraced my steps as best as I could, keeping an eye out for landmarks. The air was colder that morning, and a light mist hung low to the ground. Everything looked different. It took us almost an hour to reach the clearing with the fire pit. When we got there, it was empty. No fire ring, no bones, no tuna cans, not even the log they'd been sitting on. It wasn't there. The ground where I remembered the pit was freshly disturbed, like someone had swept it clean. The dirt looked flattened, almost smooth. I tried to explain how it had looked, how sure I was about where we were standing, but there was nothing left. Mike walked the perimeter with his radio out, checking for footprints or tire tracks. Tyler followed a game trail a little ways but came back shaking his head. The place looked untouched. We stayed out there for another hour, searching in widening circles, but we found nothing. No trace of the setup, no sign anyone had been camping. Eventually, they both shrugged it off. Maybe I'd gotten turned around. Maybe the site was farther east or west. Maybe it was just some old camp that got cleaned up. But I knew what I'd seen. The fire pit hadn't been old. The bones were fresh. And that person, whoever they were, had been real. I went back to the same area a few weeks later when my GPS was working again. I thought maybe I'd find that clearing again and make sense of it. I followed every branch of that old road, every spur, and I never found it. The paths looked different, like new growth had swallowed them up. Now when I think about it, what unsettles me most isn't the person I saw. It's how quickly someone could erase every trace of being out there, like they'd been waiting, watching me leave. And as soon as I was gone, they cleaned everything up and vanished into the woods. I still have that folded map with my last coordinates marked. Sometimes I look at it and wonder how close I really was to the border, or to whoever was living out there. Because up in that part of the country, once you're off the main road, you could be 5 miles from anyone, or 500 feet from someone who doesn't want you to know they're there. It was close to midnight when I heard it, a sharp 2-note whistle somewhere down the hollow. I was camped alone along a narrow ridge above Spruce Knob, the highest point in West Virginia. I'd set up my tent just off the trail where the trees opened enough for a view of the valley lights far below. The wind had been constant all evening, the kind that never fully stopped but came in long, restless breaths through the spruce trees, hissing over the needles. I was half asleep in my bag, headlamp still dim to a low red glow, when that whistle cut through the night. 2 quick notes, clear and deliberate. At first, I thought it was some kind of bird call echoing weirdly through the trees, but it didn't fit. There was a rhythm to it, too human. It came from somewhere down the hollow to my left, 100 yards maybe, carried just enough by the wind to reach me. I froze, every sound around me sharpening in my ears. The ridge was quiet except for the wind. No crickets, no frogs, not even the rustle of an animal. I waited. Then after maybe 10 seconds, it came again. Same pitch, same two-note pattern. Not close but not far either. Just that eerie, whistled signal hanging in the dark. My first thought was that it might be another backpacker. Maybe someone who lost the trail and was trying to get attention. But that didn't make sense. This wasn't a busy area. It was late in the season, late in the night, and I hadn't seen another person since I'd parked at the trailhead that morning. I reached over and killed my headlamp completely. The red light vanished, and my tent walls turned to dim gray shapes under the faint moonlight filtering through the branches. I unzipped the sleeping bag just enough to listen better. Nothing. Then, faintly, I heard the sound of boots. Slow, deliberate crunches on the leaf litter somewhere down the slope. They were uneven, someone walking without a flashlight, picking their steps carefully. It wasn't the rhythmic trot of a deer or the scuffle of a raccoon. It was slow, heavy, human. I stayed absolutely still. The steps continued for a few seconds, then stopped. I waited for them to start again, but they didn't. I could feel my pulse in my throat, loud and fast. The air inside the tent felt smaller, the silence pressing in. I thought about calling out, but something deep in my gut said not to. There was something wrong about the way whoever it was had stopped, like they knew exactly where I was. The wind shifted direction slightly, and for a second, I thought I heard breathing out there. Just faint, steady breathing carried on the moving air. Then it was gone, swallowed by the sound of the trees. I reached for my pack slowly, my hand trembling a bit. I found my knife, small mostly for cutting cord or food, and kept it close. My flashlight was next, but I didn't turn it on yet. I didn't want to give away my exact spot. Then the whistle came again. 2 notes, same as before, but this time it came from behind me. I froze, completely rigid. That meant whoever had been down the hollow had circled uphill, moving around me in the dark. And now there were at least 2 of them, or one person who'd somehow moved impossibly fast without making a sound between spots. My skin crawled. The tent suddenly felt like a bright flag in the open. I knew I couldn't stay there. I packed up faster than I ever have in my life. My fingers were clumsy, shaking. I stuffed my sleeping bag half unrolled into the bottom of the pack, collapsed the tent poles without care, and jammed everything inside. I didn't even bother with straps. I just needed to move. I clicked on my headlamp and started hiking the ridge trail back toward the car, heart pounding so hard it felt like I could hear it echoing in my ears. The trail wound along the ridgeline, narrow, with steep drop-offs on both sides in places. The trees closed in tight on sections, branches scraping my jacket as I hurried through. The beam of my headlamp bounced wildly with every step, cutting through mist and catching flashes of white bark, patches of moss and the gleam of wet leaves. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen. The wind still moved through the spruce tops, but underneath it, I could hear faint, scattered sounds, like someone stepping onto dead branches in the distance. I couldn't tell how far back they were. Once I thought I caught the faintest flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, a pale shape between the trees. But when I turned my light, there was nothing. My mind ran through every possibility. Maybe it was hunters messing around. Maybe it was some locals trying to scare campers. Or maybe it was something worse, someone living out there not wanting to be found. Spruce Knob and the Monongahela backcountry had a reputation for being remote, and I'd read stories before about people disappearing or stumbling onto old camps hidden miles from any road. I kept hiking. The night air bit through my jacket as I gained elevation along the ridge. The temperature had dropped close to freezing, and my breath fogged in the beam of my light. At one point, I turned it off and stood in darkness. My eyes adjusted slowly, the woods flattening into shapes and shadows. I didn't hear anything behind me now, just the wind and the distant creak of trees swaying. But the silence felt loaded, like something was waiting. I turned the light back on and kept moving. After about 40 minutes, I started recognizing sections of the trail, a particular fallen log, a small cairn someone had stacked beside the path, the faint shimmer of frost beginning to coat the leaves. My body moved on autopilot, legs burning, chest tight, but I didn't dare slow down. Eventually, I saw the faint glint of metal ahead, the small signpost marking the spur trail that led down to the parking area. Relief hit me hard enough to make me dizzy. I started down the slope, boots slipping a little on the damp ground. My car was about half a mile away at the bottom, parked at a gravel turnout beside a creek. Halfway down, I turned off my light again just to check behind me. The forest was silent, dark, and still. I waited maybe 30 seconds, trying to convince myself I was alone. Then faintly, I saw a flicker of red through the trees, a small blinking light. At first, I thought it was a taillight from my car catching a reflection. But it was too far into the woods, maybe 50 yards off the trail. It blinked once, then again slow, steady, like a bike light being turned on and off by hand. Then it stopped. The forest went completely black again. I didn't wait to see if it would start again. I turned and practically ran the rest of the way to the car. My legs ached by the time I reached the gravel, lungs burning in the cold air. My breath came out in hard bursts that hung in front of the headlights as I fumbled for my keys. When I finally got the door open, I tossed my pack in, locked the doors immediately, and just sat there for a minute breathing, watching the tree line through the windshield. It was dead quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The forest stood there motionless, my headlights throwing long shadows across the trunks. Nothing moved. Then, deep in the trees, I saw the red light again. Just one blink, then gone. I drove out of there without even changing out of my hiking boots. I didn't look back until I hit the paved road miles down the mountain. Later that night, parked at a gas station under the yellow lights, I sat there staring at my reflection in the car window, still shaking, trying to convince myself it was just some kind of weird prank or signal. But the more I thought about it, the less that made sense. The whistles had come from two directions at once. The steps had stopped right when I'd gone quiet. Whoever it was out there knew exactly where I was, and they weren't lost. They were watching. I haven't camped alone since. I had been fishing since morning, miles from town, in one of those places you only find when you follow a rumor. A coworker had told me about a creek somewhere west of Millfield, past a few farms, where the trout supposedly hit hard after the rain. I'd parked near a rusted cattle gate that morning and hiked in with my rod, lunch packed in a cooler and a small tackle box strapped over my shoulder. The day had been quiet, warm, the kind that smells like pine and mud and the faint sweetness of water weeds. I caught a few fish, nothing huge, but enough to make it feel worth the trip. By the time I packed up, the sun was getting low, turning the trees gold and the air cool enough that I could see my breath when I exhaled. The GPS said the quickest route home was back the way I came, then right onto a smaller road that looped around toward the highway. I'd never been that way before, but I trusted it. It was already dusk, and the light was fading faster than I expected. I drove slow, tires crunching over gravel, the sound echoing between trees. The road narrowed as I went, with thick brush on either side and branches hanging low enough to scrape the roof. I remember glancing at the gas gauge and thinking I'd better make it to the main road before dark. My phone had one bar of signal, flickering in and out. A few minutes later, I came around a bend and saw a sign nailed to a tree, just a piece of plywood. Painted by hand in red letters, "Bridge out 2 miles." The letters were uneven, like someone wrote it fast. I slowed down, rolled past it, then stopped. I looked at the map again. The GPS didn't show any bridge, just a line of road cutting through empty green. It said I was still en route. I sat there for a second, engine idling, debating whether to keep going or turn back. Then I decided not to risk it. I'd already been in spots like this before, where bridge out meant a washed-out crossing or an impassable drop, and I didn't want to get stuck out here after dark. I put the truck in reverse, planning to back up until I found a spot wide enough to turn around. But as I did, I noticed headlights behind me. Or more accurately, no headlights. Just the faint outline of a car about 50 yards back, parked dead center in the road. I hadn't heard it approach. It hadn't been there when I came around the bend. I could just make out its shape through the trees. Low, maybe a sedan, dark color. My first thought was that it was another lost driver, maybe someone local heading home. I rolled down my window and waved an arm out, motioning for them to go around. They didn't move. I could see nothing through their windshield, just the faint reflection of my own taillights bouncing off the glass. I waited, engine rumbling, but they just sat there. No lights, no motion. I waved again, a little more exaggerated this time, but nothing. The air had that stillness you get right before full dark, when the crickets stop and the woods go silent. I felt it then, something uneasy, heavy in my chest. I shifted back into drive, moved forward a few feet, then reversed again, testing if they'd react. They did. Every time I moved, they matched it, closing the gap a little like they were playing some quiet game of mirror. I stopped moving completely. My headlights caught the edge of their front bumper now, close enough that I could make out the dull shine of wet dust. The other car's driver's door opened slowly, creaking wide until it stopped against the hinge. The inside was completely black. No one stepped out, no sound. Just the open door swinging slightly with the weight of it. My pulse started hammering. I don't scare easily, but something about that still door and that silence. It didn't feel like a person just getting out of their car. It felt wrong. I remember my hand shaking as I put the truck in drive. I floored it. The gravel kicked up behind me, hammering the undercarriage as I tore down that narrow road. Branches whipped at the sides, scraping deep into the paint. The trees blurred past like dark pillars. The road twisted and split and narrowed again. But I just kept my foot down, headlights bouncing over washouts and potholes. Every shadow looked like something stepping out in front of me. I hit a rut so hard that the cooler in the back flew open, scattering tackle and bottles across the floor. I didn't slow down until I saw the faint glow of a distant road sign, pavement ahead. When I hit the highway, I didn't even look behind me. I just turned right and drove until I saw lights again. A gas station with 2 pumps and a flickering sign. I pulled in fast, breathing hard, parked crooked near the side, and shut off the engine. My hands were slick with sweat. I sat there for a minute, watching the highway, half expecting to see that same dark car roll up behind me. Nothing came. When I finally got out, I noticed the back bumper. Fresh dents, scratches, and a long smear of reddish mud streaked across the paint, like I'd backed into something soft and wet. I hadn't felt any impact on the road. My tailgate was bent slightly, like it had been nudged from behind. I stared at it for a while, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I clipped something when I turned around. Maybe that car had been closer than I thought. But none of that explained why I hadn't heard or seen anyone. Inside the gas station, the air smelled like old coffee and oil. A man behind the counter looked up from his newspaper and nodded. I asked if he knew the gravel road west of Millfield, the one that cut through the hills. He looked at me for a second before answering. That road's been closed for years, he said. Washed out back in 19 when the creek flooded. Nobody uses it anymore. He shook his head slightly. You sure you were on that one? I told him about the handwritten sign, the one that said, "Bridge out 2 miles." He frowned. Yeah, I've seen that, he said slowly. Someone keeps putting that up. County tears it down, it shows up again a week later. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. I just nodded and went back out to the truck. I sat there for a while before leaving. The road ahead was quiet, just the hum of highway traffic fading into the distance. I checked my rearview mirror again and again, half expecting to see that dark car trailing me. Lights still off, keeping its distance. But there was nothing, only empty asphalt and the reflection of my own taillights. When I got home later that night, I parked in the driveway and got out slowly, walking once around the truck. The mud on the bumper had started to dry, caked into the grooves of the scratches. It wasn't the kind of clay you find near Millfield. It was thicker, darker, almost maroon. Scraped a bit off with my key, and it flaked away like dried paint. I could still see faint streaks under the tailgate, like handprints smudged into the dust. I stood there for a long time staring at them, the crickets loud in the grass, the night otherwise still. The next weekend, I drove back toward that area in daylight, just to see. I never found the turnoff again. Every road I tried ended at a gate or a dead end. The GPS wouldn't even load the same route. It just rerouted me to the main highway every time. I thought about asking the county office about that bridge, but I didn't. I didn't want to hear the answer. Sometimes when I drive back roads at dusk now, I catch myself checking the mirrors too often, watching for headlights that never turn on, for cars that keep the same distance no matter how fast I go. I tell myself it was nothing, just another traveler on a forgotten road. But then I remember that open door, the way it swung slowly and stopped midair, and the way that road disappeared from every map after that night. And I can't help but think that whatever was out there, whoever that was, it never wanted to pass. It just wanted me to keep driving until I left the woods behind. It was early September when I decided to hike near Pactola Reservoir in South Dakota. The weather had been perfect that week. Clear skies, low humidity, and that early fall chill that makes the air smell sharper somehow. I'd been camping at a small site north of the lake for 2 nights, just trying to clear my head after a busy summer. That morning I packed a small day bag, water, a sandwich, a first aid kit, and my camera, and decided to follow one of the unmarked game trails that ran deeper into the hills west of the reservoir. I wasn't planning on going far, maybe just exploring off-trail a bit, see if I could find a nice spot overlooking the lake. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the forest was quiet except for the occasional crunch of my boots or the distant call of a bird. After about 40 minutes, I was deep enough that I couldn't hear the highway anymore. The trail I'd been following started to fade out, turning into patches of broken brush and faint depressions in the soil where deer or elk might have passed. I kept going for another 10 minutes before I saw something strange through the trees, bright blue and green, like a tarp catching the sunlight. At first, I thought it might be an old campsite someone left behind, or maybe a ranger's supply cache. As I got closer, I realized it was more like a makeshift shelter. Someone had stretched a couple of tarps between thick pines, tied down with rope, and supported by a crude log frame. Pine boughs were stacked along one side, and a section of the ground had been cleared out like a small living area. It didn't look new, but it didn't look old either. Somewhere in between, like whoever built it might have been there within the last few weeks. I hesitated before stepping closer. There was a faint smell of old smoke, maybe from a small fire pit a few feet away that had been covered with dirt. I noticed boot prints in the soil, a few crushed food wrappers, a metal pot half buried under pine needles. Inside the shelter there were several cans of food, beans, soup, fruit, lined up neatly against one side. A rolled sleeping bag lay in the corner, faded red and patched in a few spots. None of it looked rotten or soaked, which told me it hadn't been abandoned too long ago. Then I saw the string. It was a thin piece of cord running across the back of the shelter, stretched between 2 nails hammered into the log frame. Dozens of Polaroid photos were clipped along it with wooden clothespins. They hung in a crooked line, some slightly curled from moisture. I stepped closer, squinting in the dim light that filtered through the tarp. Each photo showed a tent or a campsite. Some were in deep woods, surrounded by thick pines or rocky hillsides. Others were near lakes or open clearings. A few even showed campfires burning, faint orange glows against the dark. Every single photo had been taken from a distance, through trees, behind brush, or from across a clearing. Always hidden, always from the perspective of someone watching. The more I looked, the more my stomach turned. There had to be 30 or 40 photos, maybe more. None of them had people in them, but the tents, the firewood stacks, the way the chairs were arranged, it was all too familiar. Like someone had spent months, maybe years, stalking campsites and quietly photographing them without being seen. I felt something cold press into my chest when I saw one photo near the end of the line. The tent in it was the same make and color as mine, dark green, dome-shaped, with a small fold near the base where the fabric had been patched. The background matched too, same set of pines, same big granite boulder just behind it. I bent closer, feeling my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The photo had been taken from the woods, maybe 20 or 30 feet away from my campsite. It wasn't just a similar tent, it was mine. And the light in the picture looked like early morning. That meant whoever took it had been near my camp that very morning, watching from the trees while I was still asleep. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. The forest outside felt too quiet, too still. I listened for footsteps or breathing, but there was nothing. My hands were shaking as I slowly backed away from the cord. I looked around the shelter again, scanning for any sign that someone was nearby. The sleeping bag was flattened like it had been used recently. There was an empty can near the tarp flap, the lid peeled halfway open. I couldn't tell if whoever had been there had just left or was planning to come back soon. My chest felt tight as I stepped backward, out into the open woods. Every crack of a twig or whisper of wind made me flinch. I didn't run right away. I forced myself to walk slow and quiet, keeping my eyes in every direction. But as soon as I got far enough that I couldn't see the shelter anymore, I broke into a sprint. I didn't care about the direction, just away from there, away from whatever had been watching me that morning. I didn't stop until I reached the main trail again, lungs burning, shirt clinging to my back with sweat. The forest looked normal there. Sunlight through the trees, birds calling, distant sound of boats on the reservoir. But everything felt different. I could still see those photos in my head, all those campsites, all those people who had no idea someone was hiding in the woods. Watching, when I got back to the trailhead, I sat on the hood of my car for a long time before I could even start the engine. My hands were trembling when I finally drove to the ranger station a few miles south. I didn't even know how to explain what I'd found at first. I told them there was a strange camp, with photos and supplies, and that I thought someone was still out there. The ranger who took the report listened quietly, writing everything down. When I told him about the photo of my tent, he looked at me for a few seconds, then sighed and said, "You're not the first to find something like that." He said they'd found similar setups around Pactola and Sheridan Lake over the years. Small hidden shelters, sometimes with food or tools, always abandoned by the time anyone got there. A few had photos too. Some of them even had trail camera cards full of pictures of hikers and campers, all taken from the tree line. They'd never caught whoever was behind it. Every time they found one, the camp was cold. The trail faded. No prints, no vehicles, nothing useful, just like the one I'd stumbled into. He offered to send a patrol to check the area, but I didn't go back. I packed up my gear that afternoon and left the campground before sunset. I didn't sleep much that night in town. Just lay there thinking about how close that person must have been to me, standing there in the dark woods with a camera, waiting for me to move or turn or maybe just to keep sleeping. I kept imagining the faint sound of a shutter clicking while I was still half asleep, completely unaware. A week later, I checked a few hiking forums online, trying to see if anyone else had ever mentioned something like that around Pactola. There were a few vague posts, mostly rumors about a hermit photographer or someone who lived out there off the grid, but nothing concrete. Most people dismissed it as local gossip. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about how organized that shelter had been. The lined-up cans, the neat row of photos, the clean sleeping bag. It wasn't random. Whoever it was, they'd been there for a while. They had a system. Months later, I still think about that one photo. The angle it was taken from, the focus on my tent flap, the faint morning light. I think about how many others there might be, hanging in some other shelter deep in the Black Hills, showing more campsites, more people who never knew they were being watched. I've camped plenty of times since then, but I never sleep deeply anymore. Every time I wake up before dawn and see the tree line silhouetted against the pale light, I can't help but wonder if there's someone out there, standing still, camera in hand, waiting for me to move. It was early March, the kind of cold that bit through every layer you owned. The thermometer nailed to the side of the research cabin read 15 degrees when I checked it that night. The air had that brittle, crystalline stillness that only came after weeks of hard freeze. Even breathing outside made a faint crackle in the scarf over my mouth. I'd snowshoed in earlier that day, following the narrow trail that wound through the black spruce and out toward the flat white expanse of Tustamina Lake. The cabin sat just back from the shoreline, a squat, single-room structure built decades ago by biologists who'd used it to monitor snowpack and lake ice conditions. Inside, it smelled faintly of kerosene and pine from the rough boards that lined the walls. I'd arrived before sunset, legs burning from the 2-hour trek, and set about recording the barometric readings and swapping out a set of frozen batteries from the temperature sensors outside. The silence was absolute once I stopped moving. No wind, no animal sounds, just the muffled hush that came when snow buried everything. I heated a small pot of water on the propane stove and ate freeze-dried stew while sitting on the bunk, watching condensation bead on the window glass. My only light came from the lantern hanging above the small table, and the moon outside, full and bright enough to cast sharp shadows on the snow. When I stepped outside to check the anemometer one last time, the world was so bright it looked like daylight, except for the faint blue tint to everything. By the time I turned in, it was close to midnight. The logs in the small stove hissed quietly as they burned. I fell asleep under 2 sleeping bags, still wearing my thermals and hat. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, a sound pulled me out of sleep. A deep, hollow crack that rolled through the air like thunder. I lay still for a moment, half awake, trying to figure out if I'd dreamed it. Then another came, closer this time. It was the unmistakable boom of shifting ice. I'd heard it before. That groaning sound that happened when temperatures dropped fast and pressure built beneath the frozen surface of the lake. Still, something about it felt off. There was a rhythm to it, like it was echoing from the same spot instead of traveling across the ice. I sat up, listening. The cabin walls creaked quietly as they contracted in the cold. Then silence again. I swung my legs over the bunk, pulled on my parka, and went to the small window facing the lake. The moonlight poured across the ice, almost too bright to look at. The surface stretched flat and silver, broken only by the dark shadow of the tree line far across. That's when I saw it, something moving out there. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, some shifting patch of moon shadow. But it moved too deliberately. Whatever it was low to the ground, crawling slowly across the ice toward the cabin. The movement was steady, almost dragging, and I couldn't hear anything, not even the crunch of ice. It was too small to be a person, too slow to be a wolf. My brain tried to label it as a seal out of instinct, but that made no sense. The lake wasn't connected to the ocean except through miles of frozen river. I stared for a long minute, unsure if I was imagining it. The shape was faint, maybe 100 yards out, and the longer I looked, the less certain I was that I'd seen anything at all. I turned away to grab my flashlight, heart thudding faster now. When I looked back, it was gone. Curiosity got the better of me. I slipped on my boots and cracked open the door. The cold hit like a solid wall, instantly stinging my eyes and lungs. The moon was still bright, lighting up every inch of the snow between me and the lake. I stepped out onto the porch and waited, listening. Nothing moved. The only sound was the faint ticking of cooling wood behind me. I aimed my headlamp out across the snow. The beam cut a bright white path across the ice. There was nothing there, no movement, no sound. But when I looked closer at the snow leading down from the cabin, I saw faint lines etched across the frost, like something had dragged itself toward shore. They weren't boot tracks or animal prints, just long, shallow grooves, irregular but clearly made by something moving low. I followed them without thinking, stepping carefully so I didn't disturb the markings. They wound out from the edge of the lake, looping halfway toward the cabin before stopping abruptly, as if whatever made them had simply vanished. I turned in a slow circle, scanning with the light, but the snow was undisturbed beyond that. Then I noticed the direction they came from, straight out toward a darker patch near the middle of the lake. When I swept the beam over it, the light seemed to sink into open water. The ice had fractured there, leaving a wide lead where liquid water showed through. Steam curled faintly from the surface, catching the moonlight like smoke. I stood there for several minutes, staring at the gap, the frost building in my eyelashes until everything sparkled. Then another sharp crack rolled out from under the ice somewhere to my left, closer this time. I turned and saw nothing but the smooth white expanse. My hands had gone numb by then, so I backed away and returned to the cabin, bolting the door behind me. Inside, the silence felt heavier now. I sat by the stove until the shaking in my hands stopped, telling myself it was just ice shifting. The grooves could have been caused by a block of snow sliding off, or maybe a wolverine moving low to the ground. That thought was enough to let me drift back into uneasy sleep. When morning came, pale light crept through the frost-coated window. The air inside the cabin was bitter cold, the stove long dead. I boiled water for coffee and forced myself to go outside again. The world looked calm and untouched, the lake smooth under a faint layer of new frost. I walked down to where the grooves had been, half expecting them to be gone, but they were still there. Thin, frozen ridges where moisture had refrozen overnight. They led straight toward the outlet where the ice broke into open water. When I reached the edge, I saw them, marks clawed into the ice deep and jagged, like something had tried to pull itself out of the water and failed. Each one was about the width of my fingers. 4 or 5 parallel gouges raked across the surface. They were frozen solid now, little ridges of clear ice curling up at the edges. I crouched and touched one. It was smooth inside, polished by motion before it froze again. I stood there for a long time, staring out across the lake. The open lead was larger now, steaming faintly in the morning light. Couldn't tell how deep it went, but the blackness beneath the water was absolute. Maybe something had fallen through, an animal crossing the lake in the night, a moose or a bear. The idea made sense except for how far out it had been and the strange way it had moved. But what else could it be? I took photos for the report, made a note of the temperature and wind speed, and then went back to the cabin. The rest of the day passed in silence, but I couldn't shake the image of those claw marks. Every time I stepped outside to collect data, I found my eyes drifting back to that spot on the lake. Nothing else moved out there. By evening, clouds had started rolling in from the west and the light turned flat and gray. I packed up what I could, deciding to leave first thing in the morning. As night fell, the temperature dropped again, and I heard the ice groan and pop under the growing pressure. Each sound echoed differently after that, like something shifting beneath the surface, slow and heavy. When I finally left the next day, I paused at the edge of the trees for one last look back. The lake was blank and still, a white sheet stretching out to the horizon. The open water near the outlet had frozen over again, but faint dark lines radiated outward from that spot, like veins trapped beneath the ice. I never found out what had crawled across the lake that night, or if it was even alive when it reached the water. But sometimes when I'm reviewing audio logs from that station, I still hear faint, hollow cracks in the background, slow, rhythmic, almost like something moving. We were 3 days into the backcountry, somewhere deep in the sawtooth wilderness of Idaho. The trail we'd taken had faded away after the first day, and by the time we reached the basin, it felt like we were the only people for miles. No noise but the wind through the trees and the creek running cold down the valley. We'd made camp on a flat patch of ground near the timberline, between 2 big pines with soft needles underfoot. The ground there was covered in a thick mat of brown pine needles, damp underneath from the rain that had fallen the night before. We'd hung our food bags in a tree, got a small fire going, and turned in early. That night I woke up a few times because of the wind pushing against the sides of the tent. It had that hollow sound to it, the kind that makes you think something's moving outside, even when it's just air. Tyler was next to me, breathing steady, wrapped tight in his sleeping bag. We'd been hiking hard, so he was out cold. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I must have drifted off again. When I woke up the last time, the light outside was just starting to turn gray, the kind that comes right before dawn. For a minute, I just lay there listening. The forest was quiet. No birds yet, just the faint trickle of the creek somewhere downhill. I noticed Tyler wasn't making any sound, which struck me as odd. He usually snored a little. I rolled over to see if he was still asleep, but his sleeping bag was empty, unzipped halfway and collapsed flat like he'd just gotten up. I sat there, waiting, thinking maybe he'd gone to take a piss or something. But after a couple of minutes, I noticed the ground outside the tent looked strange. Through the mesh of the door, I could see the pine needles disturbed. Not just footprints, but something dragged like a broad, uneven trail pressed into the needles, stretching past the tent toward the creek. My stomach went tight. I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped out barefoot, the cold ground biting at my feet. The air had that sharp, wet smell from the night dew. I crouched down and looked at the marks more closely. It looked like something heavy had been pulled or dragged through there, about 1.5 feet wide, flattening the needles in a smooth line. It curved around one of the pines and continued downhill. I followed it with my eyes until it disappeared into the brush. There were no boot prints beside it, no scuff marks from someone walking, just that smooth drag. I called out Tyler's name once quietly. No answer. The cold had started to bite through my shirt by then, so I went back into the tent, threw on my jacket and boots, and grabbed the flashlight. The batteries were low, but it still gave off a weak yellow beam. I followed the trail downhill through the trees. The forest was still dark, just faint light filtering through the high branches. Every sound felt louder than it should. The crunch of needles under my boots, the creak of trees shifting, the faint burble of the creek getting closer. The drag marks led straight down the slope, winding between rocks and roots, as if whatever had made them had moved without hesitation. No sign of struggle, no scattered gear, nothing. The farther I went, the quieter it felt. The air was still, no wind, no birds, just the sound of water somewhere ahead. About 100 yards from camp, the marks ended abruptly at the edge of the creek bed. The water there was shallow, maybe ankle deep, running fast over smooth stones. I crouched down, looking for anything. Footprints, broken branches, a sign that someone had crossed, but there was nothing. The drag marks stopped in the middle of the creek bed, just vanished. No splashes, no sign of slipping. It was like whatever had made them had just gone straight into the water and disappeared. I called out again, louder this time. Nothing came back except the sound of water rushing over rocks. I stood there for a while, scanning both sides of the creek, feeling that sick weight in my chest. It didn't make sense. I kept thinking maybe he'd sleepwalked, or maybe gotten up disoriented, but he didn't have a history of that. He wasn't drunk, wasn't on anything. He'd been fine before bed. After a while, I went back up to camp, still half expecting to see him walking back, maybe laughing it off. But the tent was just as I'd left it, the fire pit cold, his pack still there. His boots were gone, but his jacket and flashlight were still beside his sleeping bag. It didn't add up. I waited a couple of hours, pacing the campsite, calling his name every few minutes. Around 9, the sun finally crested the ridge, lighting up the trees and the mist off the creek. Still no sign of him. I hiked up to the ridge behind camp where we'd gotten a weak signal the day before. It took almost 2 hours of climbing and moving around before I managed to get a single bar of service. I called for help, gave our GPS coordinates, told them my friend had disappeared sometime before dawn. They said they'd send a team, but it could take a day or more to reach us. That afternoon, I marked the area with bright tape from our gear, hoping the search crew would find it easily. I walked back down the slope again, retracing the drag marks to the creek over and over. Every time I ended up standing in the same spot, staring at that empty space where the trail just stopped. The light shifted as the sun went behind clouds, the air cooling again. I remember kneeling there, running my fingers over the flattened needles, trying to figure out what could have made them. It wasn't shaped like a boot or animal track. It was too wide, too even. By the time night fell again, I'd built a fire that I kept going until morning. I barely slept. Every sound made me flinch. The cracking of branches, the wind coming in short bursts through the trees. I kept turning toward the creek, half expecting to see movement down there. The rescue team arrived the next afternoon, 3 people on horseback and 2 with dogs. I led them down to the creek and showed them the marks. They looked at each other, didn't say much. They searched up and down the valley for hours, calling his name, combing the banks of the creek. The next day they expanded the search downstream. It was the second afternoon when they found him, about 6 miles away, lying in a patch of grass beside the creek, barefoot and shivering. They said he looked like he'd been walking for days but couldn't remember how he got there. When they brought him back, he was wrapped in a blanket, face pale, lips blue. His feet were torn up from the rocks and frost. He didn't say anything for the first few hours, just stared at the fire. Later, when the medics asked if he remembered anything, he said only one thing, that he'd followed the light. They pressed him, but that was all he said. I followed the light. When I finally saw him back at the ranger station, he looked different. Tired, distant, like part of him was still out there. He didn't remember leaving the tent, didn't remember the creek, nothing. He just remembered waking up cold and lost, with the sound of water nearby. They never figured out what happened. No animal tracks, no signs of an attack, no evidence of a fall. Just those drag marks leading away from camp and ending in the creek bed. I went back there once more before we left the area. The tape I'd tied to the trees was still there, fluttering in the breeze. The ground had started to cover itself again with new needles, soft and undisturbed. But if you looked closely, you could still see faint impressions where the marks had been, like something heavy had passed that way once. And the forest had almost, but not completely, forgotten. Even now, years later, I can still picture that empty creek bed at dawn. The silence, the faint smell of wet pine. Every time I close my eyes, I see the same thing. The trail ending in running water, and the space beyond it where Tyler vanished for 2 days into nothing. I started my hike early that morning, just after sunrise, when the air still carried that cool dampness that hangs low over the Ouachita Mountains. The Eagle Rock Loop isn't an easy trail. It twists and climbs through ridges, crosses creeks that seem to appear out of nowhere, and runs through miles of dense pine and oak forest. I had been meaning to do the full loop solo for years, and that weekend in late October finally seemed right. The weather had been dry for weeks. The forecast was clear, and the nights were getting cold enough to keep the bugs away. I parked my car at the Little Missouri trailhead, slung my pack over my shoulders, and stepped into the quiet. The first few miles were easy enough. The trail was covered in leaves and every step crunched under my boots. Squirrels darted across the path, and once in a while, I'd hear something heavier moving farther back in the brush. Maybe a deer, maybe nothing. The deeper I went, the more the sounds of the highway faded, replaced by wind moving through the trees and the steady rhythm of my breathing. I stopped for lunch near a creek, filtered some water, and checked the map. My plan was to hike until just before sunset and find a flat spot to camp. Nothing fancy. By late afternoon, the shadows were long and the temperature was dropping fast. The light had that kind of golden haze that makes everything look peaceful, even though you know it won't last. That's when I spotted a small clearing just off the trail, a perfect spot for a tent. Someone had camped there before. There was a stone fire ring, blackened in the center from old ash, and a couple of large flat rocks arranged like makeshift seats. The ground was level, soft enough for tent stakes and far enough from the trees to feel open. I dropped my pack and decided that was home for the night. I set up my tent first, then started gathering wood, mostly out of habit. But the wind was picking up, gusting hard enough that I could see leaves swirling across the clearing. It had been a dry month, and the thought of starting a fire didn't sit right. A single spark could have started something bad out there. I stacked the wood neatly near the ring just in case, but decided I'd rely on my small propane stove for dinner instead. As the sun dropped, the forest went dark faster than I expected. By the time I finished eating, the air had turned cold and sharp, and I could see my breath in the beam of my headlamp. I crawled into my tent around 9, zipped it tight, and listened. The forest was restless that night. The wind never settled. It would die for a minute, leaving a heavy silence, then come roaring back through the trees like a passing truck. The creaking of branches sounded almost like voices sometimes. That strange trick your brain plays when it's too quiet. I kept my headlamp close, but eventually, the exhaustion from hiking all day caught up with me. I must have fallen asleep not long after 10. Sometime around midnight, I woke up to light. At first, I thought it was lightning. The inside of the tent was faintly glowing, flickering, like someone was shining a candle through the fabric, but there was no thunder. I lay still, half awake, trying to make sense of it. The light wasn't flashing, it was moving, steady, orange, and alive. I sat up, heart thudding, and unzipped the tent flap just enough to peek out. There was a fire burning in the ring, a small, steady flame, maybe knee-high, perfectly centered where I had stacked the wood but never lit it. The air was still. No footsteps, no voices, no crackling of twigs, just the quiet pop of the fire. My first thought was that maybe a spark from somewhere had started it. But that didn't make sense. The wind had died completely, and there wasn't a trace of flame anywhere else. I slipped on my boots and jacket and grabbed my flashlight. The second I stepped out, the cold hit me hard. The night sky was clear, stars everywhere, but the firelight washed them out in the clearing. The smell of wood smoke hung faintly in the air. I crouched near the ring, scanning the trees. The fire wasn't spreading. The ground around it was bare. Whoever had lit it had done it carefully, like they knew what they were doing. I shined the light around, and that's when I saw it. Just outside the circle, maybe 6 or 7 feet away, was a folding chair. A simple metal-framed camping chair pointed directly at the fire. It was empty, but when I walked closer I could see that the seat fabric was still warm. Not hot, but not cold either. Like someone had just been sitting there and left only moments before I came out. There were no footprints I could see, no gear, no backpack, nothing. Just that chair sitting there like it belonged. The feeling that someone was watching me hit all at once. That crawling pressure on the back of my neck. I turned my flashlight into the trees, sweeping it back and forth. But the forest swallowed the beam. Nothing moved. The only sound was the low hiss of the fire. I stood there for a long time, not sure what to do. Part of me wanted to call out, but the words wouldn't come. Whoever had been there could have been standing just beyond the light, watching me, and I wouldn't have known. The woods have a way of making you feel surrounded, even when you're alone. Finally, I stepped back toward my tent, keeping my light on the fire. I sat just inside the flap, boots still on, and waited. The flames kept burning, steady as ever, like they didn't need tending. I don't know how long I stayed awake, but at some point exhaustion took over again. The next thing I remember, faint dawn light was slipping through the fabric of my tent. I unzipped it slowly and looked out. The clearing was exactly as I'd found it the night before, except there was no fire. The stones were cool to the touch and the center was clean. No ash, no soot, no half-burned wood. Even the pile of sticks I'd gathered was untouched, stacked the same way I left them. The folding chair was gone too. The ground where it had been was smooth, like it had never been there at all. I stood there for a while, staring at the fire ring. It didn't make sense. Even if someone had come back during the night and cleaned everything up, there would have been signs. Ashes, footprints, something. But there was nothing, just cold, undisturbed dirt. I packed up my tent and gear as quietly as I could, every sound of the zipper or rustle of nylon feeling too loud. The woods felt different that morning, still but not calm. It was like the air was waiting for me to leave. As I started back down the trail, I kept glancing over my shoulder. Every twist in the path made me quicken my pace a little more. The forest that had seemed so peaceful the day before now felt close and watchful. I didn't stop for breakfast. I didn't even check my map until I hit a trail junction I recognized near the creek crossing. When I finally made it back to the trailhead, My car was covered in a thin layer of dust and pine needles, like I'd been gone much longer than a night. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe some hunter or hiker had stopped by in the night, lit a quick fire, and left before dawn. Maybe the ashes got blown away by the wind. But the truth is, I know what I saw. That fire burned steady and strong in a ring I hadn't touched, and that chair had been warm, like someone had just been there. Whoever it was didn't want to be seen, and they were good at staying hidden. I've hiked plenty since then, but I've never camped alone again. Every time I see an old fire ring out in the woods, I keep walking. Some things out there don't want company, and sometimes it's better not to find out who or what they belong to.